Place-based pedagogy as an alternative approach to literacy and numeracy. Before I begin my presentation, I would like to acknowledge that I am privileged to be studying on Whadjuk Noongar Boodja. I pay my respects to the elders, past, present and future, and I recognise the immense value of Aboriginal knowledges, cultures and traditions. This presentation shows how educators can participate in reconciliation by privileging Aboriginal knowledges and histories through a pedagogy that recognises the importance of a connection between land and place. This presentation looks at place-based pedagogy as an alternative approach to literacy and numeracy. It specifically focuses on a remote school with a high population of Indigenous students in Years 5 and 6. This presentation also draws on Aboriginal pedagogy, specifically through the importance of land links and community links. Place-based pedagogy involves the utilisation of place in order to provide a contextual, connected and meaningful learning experience for students. Piper explains that when educators recognise students' diverse contexts, they can apply this information in lessons to facilitate connected learning. Further, in order for students to have a positive learning experience, the learning environment must make students feel valued and included, such as through privileging students' voices and experiences in classroom activities. Such an environment can be facilitated through the inclusion and respect of local community members, such as Aboriginal elders and families. Educators are essential in the facilitation of place-based pedagogy as they give students the opportunity to apply meaning to place, such as through sharing students' histories in the classroom. National testing has expressed that there is a significant gap in numeracy and literacy in terms of Indigenous students. Rather than perceiving these students as a deficit problem, Ford explains that the disparity is a result of intergenerational disadvantage, oppression, and institutionalised discrimination. Incorporating a place-based pedagogy influenced by critical race theory attempts to work against this systemic disadvantage by privileging Indigenous knowledges and cultures. Further, this learning approach fosters cultural integrity as educators incorporate land and place. Harrison and Greenfield state that it is essential that educators use local context to ensure students produce an understanding of a relationship between place and identity. My philosophy behind this approach is influenced by critical race theory and social constructivist theory, as I want to honour students' cultural capital, accommodate for differences in discourse and promote a collaborative classroom. Place-based pedagogy employs critical race theory as it positions educators to question the dominant discourse in the classroom, so to recognise which students may be underprivileged in standardised testing and curriculum, and therefore which students may require accommodation and adjustment. Place-based pedagogy can support an alternative and connected approach to literacy and numeracy as students develop their competencies through integrated tasks, rather than in isolation. For example, an educator may take students on an excursion to collect data about native flora and document other surroundings in the local environment. This information can then be analysed and used as data in numeracy lessons and in literacy development through narrative writing. Moreover, in order for place-based pedagogy to be effective in an Indigenous community, educators must make a concerted effort to establish networks and positive relationships between schools and families. Recognising the learning environment as the third teacher highlights the importance of classroom design and layout regarding student cultural representation. Placing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags and art, as well as students' projects, propagates the notion that the school is a welcoming and inclusive space which may otherwise be distrusted due to intergenerational and epistemological racism. To avoid making this a tokenistic display, schools can invite local artists and students to collaboratively decorate in a culturally appropriate way. Literacy strategies informed by place-based learning involve the use of the social model, four resources model, and integrated learning activities. Simpson asserts that students will develop their literacy skills if they are given resources that are relevant to their context, as this allows them to make meaningful connections. Further, when students are creating their own texts, educators should encourage them to draw on their own authentic experiences that express their background and cultural identity. Coral explains that this freedom of expression empowers students, giving them the opportunity to be proud of their experiences and identity. Similarly, place-based pedagogy advocates for assessments that incorporate students' context so that the fundamental content of the lesson is accessible to the students. For example, giving an assessment with a focus on the ocean will be alienated from the experiences of students at a remote inland school, and thus these students may not be able to demonstrate their literacy capabilities as they do not understand the context of the assessment. Additionally, these assessments should be effectively used to differentiate curriculum and modify practice in future lessons, rather than solely compiled for reporting. The 4 resources model positions students to develop different literacy capabilities through systematically integrated lessons. This model is endorsed by place-based pedagogy as it emphasises the importance of meaning-making and social context in literacy development. However, a limitation of place-based pedagogy is that there is less attention given to the development of technical skills, such as the memorization of phonemic patterns. However, Metcalfe argues that students become familiar with these patterns after interacting with relevant and contextual resources. Another literacy strategy is to incorporate digital technologies such as through the iPad application cited by McLaren. These applications incorporate the ways of learning outlined by Porter as they position students to make land links, community links, and participate in storytelling. This strategy facilitates integrated and collaborative learning as students learn from and with their peers whilst using and listening to recording applications that enhance their familiarity with language. For example, students who have literacy difficulties can record their verbal text and then use this resource to guide them when creating written texts. However, a limitation of this strategy is that teachers must be trusted to stay current with technologies in order to facilitate this literacy strategy, as McLaren did through researching various applications. Another limitation of this strategy is that such digital technologies may be inaccessible to schools due to a lack of financial flexibility and may need additional funding, such as through grants, to afford these resources. Compiling a pocketbook is a project-based literacy strategy facilitated through place-based pedagogy as students employ their literacy skills when creating a book about their excursion experiences. Students can be guided by sentence starters and templates that show them how to balance images and text. This strategy orchestrates a collaborative and inquiry-based experience that is connected to students' contexts and cultures as they choose book themes and are navigators of their own research. However, a limitation of this strategy is that students will require significant scaffolding to stay on task in this stimulating environment. Similarly to literacy strategies, numeracy strategies involve the use of context in order to produce resources that are meaningful and relevant to students' lives. Place-based pedagogies can be represented through the utilisation of natural resources or cultural artefacts, for example, in maths-based activities. Porter states that the inclusion and engagement of Indigenous students can be achieved through the incorporation of land links, community links, and deconstructing and reconstructing the lesson topics. Further, bringing students on an excursion with Aboriginal community members, elders, and families will strengthen the connection to place and culture. The experience and data collected on this excursion can be used in classroom lessons as students have the opportunity to analyse authentic data that they have collected themselves. This numeracy strategy motivates student engagement as it gives students a reason to research and apply their math skills rather than using information that is out of context and therefore alienated from place. Another numeracy strategy involved in place-based learning is modelling the end product in the classroom to allow students to conceptualise what they must do throughout the task. For example, the educator can bring natural resources into the classroom to show students what they need to do when completing their own data collection and analysing throughout a numeracy task. Moreover, the overarching numeracy strategy in a place-based learning classroom is that making students feel valued and safe will mean that they are more likely to participate in educational risk-taking, which is vital in developing mathematic ability and confidence. Place-based learning is an overarching approach that informs all ways of learning as students work in a classroom that values a connection to place. These are a number of literacy and numeracy curriculum links that have influenced the lesson ideas in this presentation. For example, students editing each other's work in the digital recording lesson and students learning about data analysis through natural resources and excursions. The implementation of place-based pedagogy in an Indigenous school community is reliant on educators accessing the training they need to be culturally sensitive and inclusive, as well as being able to plan and organise relevant place-based pedagogy resources. For example, place-based pedagogy can be time-consuming to plan, leaving many teachers anxious that they will not fulfil mandatory curriculum content. Moreover, educators may feel out of depth when inviting Indigenous members into the classroom, especially due to the apprehensiveness caused by centuries of systemic racism. Thus, in order for place-based pedagogy to be effective and sustainable, educators must be given the training and support they need to facilitate alternative literacy and numeracy approaches. This presentation has given a comprehensive explanation of place-based pedagogy and how this approach can be effectively implemented in a remote Indigenous school, with the examples specifically applying to students in years 5 and 6. Place-based pedagogy relies on educators preparing lessons that establish and embrace students' understanding and connection to place. In an Indigenous context, this involves educators inviting students' families and community members into the school environment and privileging Indigenous voices so to work against the distrust caused by centuries of discrimination. Place-based learning is an effective strategy as it honours Aboriginal pedagogy, such as Yunka Porter's 8 Ways of Learning, and recognises its value, especially when teaching Indigenous students. The slight limitations of this approach concern the need for training and preparation so that it can be effectively facilitated in a meaningful way. Place-based pedagogy is an alternative approach that facilitates essential literacy and numeracy development in a way that is accessible, connected, and meaningful to its students.